Thank you for joining us. I am Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News, and welcome to Post Talk Live. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Post Talk Live. I am your host, Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News. It is Tuesday, August 4th. We're in the heat of summer, but things are definitely not slowing down on the news front. Today, we're going to be talking about one is the biggest story in biopharma, the reported AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb deal talks. Now, over the weekend, our cousins over at the Financial Times, they're majority owners of Endpoints News, we run our newsroom separately, they dropped a huge scoop that the two drug makers were in talks about a merger. It would be one of the biggest mega deals ever in pharma, if not the biggest, as well as one of the biggest deals in American corporate history. But it comes with a ton of questions about whether this will actually happen, if it's a good idea, what each company would get out of it. Will governments go along, and what it would mean for the rest of the biopharma industry? Now, there is nobody better to opine on this than Jeremy Levin. He ran M&A at Bristol Myers for years. He's been the CEO of Teva. He's now the chairman of Ovid Therapeutics. He's a longtime voice in biotech, and he is never short of opinions. For our audience, if you are joining us for the first time, hello. Post Talk Live brings you the reporting, the analysis, and the debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom live to you. If you're joining us on YouTube and you're not already following us, hit that little subscribe button below our feed to get alerts about future live streams. You can also sign up for the Post Hoc email on your Endpoints News subscription page. Jeremy, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. For our audience, if you're joining us on YouTube, you can use a little chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. You can join us into the conversation. Our producers are watching. They will feed us any great questions. And if you missed the show, recordings are going to live on YouTube and Spotify. You can share that around. So, Jeremy, let me just turn right to you. I mean, we have been in a period of M&A and industry change that has really been defined by, small pipeline deals and bolt-ons. I think that after a lot of big consolidation in the industry that we saw in the 2000s and the early 2010s that were driven by cost and synergy, that all really slowed down. And Bristol Myers might have even kind of marked the end of that period with their Celgene deal. What drove kind of the prior era of mega deals and consolidation that we saw previously? We're going to talk about the future and what's happening now, but like when you kind of look back to that period, and the mega deals of the future that we all used to cover and, be involved in, like what was driving that at the time when we think about those really major transactions, $50 billion, $100 billion?
Drew, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's really an interesting moment. And as our industry evolves, every period of time has the types of deals that fit that period of time. So your description of the mega deals in the past were often driven by some key elements. The more sensible ones were driven by the need to get larger scale, different countries, geographic spread, obviously, and then certain capabilities that somebody may want. For example, manufacturing of biologics, Sanofi Genzyme story. This kind of a thing was well understood. Then there were the less well thought through. These were an endeavor to create synergies. That meant effectively that the CFO was driving it. Effectively, the CEO had no real clear vision of what they wanted to do. And so they would buy a company with the intent to cut to success. Never a great strategy, but often occurred. And then there was a few which really did something quite remarkable. And those were, for example, Takeda moving out of Japan into America and Europe. So there are a number of different things that occurred in the past that had a logic, but the overwhelming ones, or the least successful ones, were the ones that said we will cut to success.
It's really interesting to hear this differentiation, because I think in a lot of times when we talk about these now, I think people forget that there were deals that were, quite strategic, and they had even though they were big giant kind of corporate combinations, they were not cost and synergy driven versus the ones that were. Was there something fundamentally different about the structure of the industry in that time? Just, saying, you know, hey, the companies were smaller, they were less global, maybe their capabilities had a lot of differences and they wanted, you mentioned the kind of Japan expansion that we've seen. And was the industry so much less consolidated during that period that it made sense to do those strategic transactions and there was room for them, as opposed to kind of what I think often we think of more recently with these deals as the cost driven and synergy driven transactions?
Well, I think a couple things were very different in the past. The first was the level of innovation that was available to those companies was significantly lower.
Mhm.
Today, you have just a plethora of different opportunities
Right.
in smaller companies. So, number one, top line driven novel new drugs, not that common, but certainly there. Second is the kinds of economic growth that has occurred that we're experiencing today is far different from what it was 20 years ago. The economy was smaller, the access was different, the types of patient were different, the types of payers were different. All of these were shaking out in a way that,
Mhm.
for example, there were, I believe, 14 or 15, maybe even more than that, PBMs at that time in America alone. Today, there are only four. So the insurance process of paying for drugs very different. All of this drove different considerations in different companies. But often, as I said to you, the ones that failed then, and we can see it because you can just simply say, how much money did you pay? How much did you get back?
Right.
It's really straightforward. You can look at those, and there were a slew of them that failed because they went after synergies. And today, the much larger economy, global reach critical, rise of China as an innovation center,
Mhm.
all
Mhm.
different
Mhm.
situations from what was. And then something else happened in the period of time 2009 through to uh, 10 years later, 2019. And that was the extraordinary changes that occurred with immuno-oncology,
Right.
which just left huge potential cliffs. And by the way, what we're seeing now, a very similar situation beginning to develop in the GLP-1 area.
Right, right. Well, and let me ask you about that. And obviously, oncology is a big piece of that as well as we think about the huge patent cliffs that pharma is facing. So I think it's been interesting to read some people speculate that we might be heading for a new era of mega mergers or something like that, and then now to see the reports of this potential deal. Is this all kind of patent cliff driven? Like, what do you think is driving? I realize we're in a hypothetical place right now. These companies haven't announced it, and we should emphasize that. Um, but what about the situation now could drive a new wave of big consolidation? Do the strategic reasons exist? And we'll talk about these companies specifically, but as you look across the industry, do you see a strategic rationale for big companies needing to get a lot bigger, or to expand geographies or be in market areas that they're not?
No is the answer.
Yeah.
I think this is an ill-conceived notion that big is good. Innovation is good. At the end of the day, consolidation, which is designed to create scale, is no longer consequential.
Hmm.
What you have today is you have the ability, and people will probably disagree with that. On the other hand, you have mid cap biotech companies which are selling amazing medicines. You have large numbers of small cap companies which have got extraordinary medicines in their pipelines. And then you look at the balance sheets of many of these larger companies. They could easily afford scooping up large numbers of innovation and drive their top line.
Yeah.
if they so chose to do so. Global reach, most of this was done over the last decade. And then the other aspect, which is synergies. Look, everybody who's had half a business brain was busy carving out and creating synergies over the last decades. So I'm not really sure what you're going to get out of this old-fashioned way of looking at acquisition and then saying, I'm going to carve out
Yeah.
synergies.
Well, let's talk about this, hypothetical deal at hand. I mean, Bristol very well, obviously. Why would a company like that be entertaining? I know this is kind of being talked about as a merger of equals, but I'm a believer that there's no such thing. Why would a company like that be looking at selling to or merging with a larger company? I mean, is this something you get forced into? Is there a good rationale? I mean, talk to me if you had to speculate on this a little bit. Why do this?
Well, first of all, let's reiterate what you said at the outset.
Yeah.
There is no evidence that this is going ahead.
Right.
This could be a floating of an idea. Somebody has a discussion, it comes out. And then secondly, look, you've got one of the best CEOs in the world, Pascal Soriot. Best, outstanding,
Yeah.
absolutely remarkable. On the other hand, you've got Chris, who's equally very thoughtful, but was handed a real problem with Bristol. So I think that as each one of them contemplate the future, these are remarkable people. They're busy asking themselves, how can I, in Chris's case, for Bristol, address the foreseeable and unfortunately not dealt with Celgene cliff, which he
Right.
was handed and accepted. The Celgene acquisition should be a warning to both Chris and also to Pascal, because right there, it was an error to buy it. And you can see going forward right now the result of buying it. Now, all of that was also foreseeable. So I'm not sure exactly what is in Chris's mind. Nobody can do that. Nobody knows what's on the board's mind. But the reality is his problem is one which will not be solved. It will be hidden in an acquisition. And I think he knows that. I
Right.
think he's sensible enough. Pascal, on the other hand, a brilliant strategist. Brilliant. He took a company that was stumbling, a company that didn't have an identity, in a very remarkable set of steps. He cut through everything, pivoted onto vaccines and oncology in a bet that very few thought would win out,
Yeah.
but he
Well,
knew and in his heart that it would.
and they did it. I mean, in the middle of, fighting off a Pfizer takeover of their business and, made this promise that they were going to reach $80 billion in revenue, and people, kind of patted him on the head and said, yeah, sure. Good luck. We can't believe you're doing this. And they seem to have delivered on every single promise, that they made, obviously been enormously successful as a business for shareholders. And so I think a question I have been asking a lot, and I've asked people on the street this question. I've asked, to, I think, smart people like you this question is like, why does what would AZ get out of this? One argument I have heard is that they view the US as, their biggest and most important market for the future, and this could give them a bigger footprint there. But as you said, it's not as if they don't already have a substantial footprint in the US. So, when you look at this if you can put yourself in Pascal's shoes, like what could possibly be the rationale for doing this?
To be perfectly honest, I would be deeply puzzled. Unless there's some magical new set of innovation buried in the labs of Bristol or buried in the labs of AstraZeneca that cannot possibly come out without the assistance of the other company, synergies can't drive this. It'll last for a little while. It'll
Yeah.
last for the time of Pascal to go off into the sunset. It'll last for the time for Chris to go off in the sunset. But that's an old-fashioned way of looking at things. In today's world, Pascal and Chris are deeply conscious. You're seeing the rise of China. You're seeing the rise of innovation that's burbling up there. So if I had one possible thing, is they may be thinking, maybe, that this is an opportunity for them to build out on the Bristol scale in China. But they have some very difficult questions to answer if that's the logic.
Right. Yeah. You bring up the rise of China, and and that provides a little bit of a side door into something that I want to talk about because I think we're in such an enormously volatile time in this industry. We have the rise of China, we have everything going on with AI, geopolitics are very messy. The situation with the US government and pricing here is quite messy. It just feels like we're in this moment of real uncertainty and change when the future of the industry and what it looks like is being decided at quite a grand scale. And I know you have an opinion on this, but I that to me feels like a very challenging time to be in integration and acquisition mode at this scale in a way that I presume is quite distracting and locks you up strategically for a number of years when, again, I run a newsroom, not a pharma company. My opinion isn't worth too much, but it feels like a time where flexibility and diversification, would be what you would want to have at your side rather than saying, "Hey, we're going to be dealing with the cleanup of this situation for a few years," even if it ends up being a great idea.
Well, you put your finger on two really important points. One is, what is the cost, the real cost of this kind of a mega merger? And the real cost is actually often unseen by the outside because it takes years to put together an integration of two companies of this scale. It takes years on small companies. On this scale, those two entities will be, for the next 3 to 4 years, in turmoil. Not necessarily, it'll be organized turmoil because these are two great managers, but it will be turmoil and it will be distracting beyond belief. And that's a cost which is often not factored into how you look at these deals. They'll see the price, they'll see the synergies, but the cost, the real cost, is the distraction. And the second point is that even if you have the capital to buy a company like this, and by the way, I agree with your concept. There's no such thing as a merger of equals, nor should there be.
Right.
A merger of equals just makes people feel good. You either acquire or you don't acquire. It's as simple as that. There has to be one leadership, not an endeavor to mix two extraordinary cultures. That's a recipe for a disaster. But when you pay the kinds of money that is being contemplated here, you have to ask a different question, not only about the cost of that integration, but the cost of lost opportunity. In a situation such as this, where you have one of the largest portfolio of available assets in the United States and around the world, what could you scoop up for even a fraction of what is being contemplated
Mm-hmm.
and simply integrate it and have your pipeline in a way that is perhaps remarkable? I'm not going to use a hackneyed term like string of pearls, but I will. This is the opportunity to create your string of pearls, not go and say, I'm going to get a barrel of problems that I'm going to buy and figure out what I'm going to do with it. Lilly's done this. Okay. Lilly knows it has a massive patent cliff in the future. Lilly has taken the very thoughtful approach of sequentially going out and doing quite the most remarkable set of transactions that I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
But they've understood what I've just said to you. The
Yeah.
cost of integration, they could easily buy another large company.
They could buy pretty much anybody else in the industry right
That's
now
correct.
if they decided to. Yeah, the Lilly example is such an interesting one, and I almost feel bad for bringing them up because I think I and a lot of people point to them and say, "Wow, like look what they're doing." They have this enormous war chest, so they can go out and afford to do it. And I mean, credit to them. They're putting bets that I think reflect a lot of where science is going, that are risk-taking bets. They're betting on their ability, it seems like, to be just downstream of innovation and carry that through. Whereas I feel like a lot of the deal making that I have seen recently in the industry, particularly by people who have big patent cliff problems, has been that they are better owners of assets, not necessarily better developers and innovators of those assets, but saying, hey, this has been substantially de-risked and we can put it into our machine and turn it out. And to me, those feel like, I think, subtle but enormously important distinctions when you're saying, are we a risk-taking science company, even if a lot of that risk is coming from outside of our labs and then going in, or are we a corporate owner of things? I'm oversimplifying here, but it's been interesting to watch the strategies to plug these holes, and maybe who has left things a little bit late and is going after the phase 2 and phase 3 things at bigger check sizes where the bets are more concentrated, even if they are de-risked a little bit, and who is trying that much, much earlier play that, again, we don't know how this Lilly stuff is going to work out. I mean, they could, have made 100, Dan Skravanski could make 100 bad bets in a row. And 5 years from now, I've got you on the show saying, boy, did Lilly get it all wrong. But it does seem like, to me, we are seeing the play out of two very, very different strategies about how to solve what is fundamentally the same problem.
Well, it's very interesting you say that, but first of all, don't mistake price with value.
Mm-hmm.
Critical not to do that, because the price of today, a $50 billion acquisition in today's economy and the scale of these companies, is a whole different story than a $50 billion acquisition 10 years ago. A $1 billion ticket sounds great as a headline, but actually it's trivial. It's a $200 million 10-year ago transaction. So I think one needs to ask only one question: which of these bets are going to play out in a big way scientifically? Mm-hmm. And I think that I don't know. I'm happy to come back in 10 years' time and debate the platform concept versus I've got one big thing that I'm going to go and sell, and I'm going to pay a lot of premium. Because at the end of the day, after all, Drew, the entire industry was built up by early stage investment, making multiple bets on early stage investment and then nurturing them through. Now, Lilly's has a time horizon. Their ability to look at this now is in a way which is graduated against their expected fall off of revenue. So there's two things going on: multiple transactions, early stage, and a timeline that accommodates for that.
Yeah.
That period of time also says something else. If they've made a mistake, they can correct.
Right.
Now, that's a deeply thoughtful and strategic approach. What you have in all of the other companies that are generating these large cash flows is a different approach. Some of them are saying we need to be betting in the future, but we're going to bet something right. We're going to buy something today that I can sell. That may be their imperative. That's Chris's imperative. Chris needs something that he can sell because he's got a patent cliff, the like of which is very, very, very troubling for him, I'm sure, and the board. However, there's an alternative. Why do you have to be big? Why do you have to be big rather than the most innovative?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because look at Regeneron 20 years ago. Regeneron was considered something you wouldn't touch. They stuck with innovation. Look where that took them.
Yeah.
Look at Alnylam, same story. They stuck with innovation. Look where that took them. I think that many of the pharmaceutical companies should take a page out of the book of some of the larger biotechs and say, look, we don't need to have this global scale. We need to have a culture that says innovation is what's important. We're going to go after a few key bets, and we're going to do that systematically, and that's how we're going to win. Not going back to the future 20 years ago and buying scale, because that doesn't work any longer.
Do you think you can, if you're a pharma in that kind of $100 billion market cap size and corresponding revenue and structure and everything like that, can you get smaller? Because I feel like every time I hear someone say we're getting more focused, I see, and we had we had a little bit of this announcement from Pfizer over the last few years. Oh, we're, cutting a billion here or 2 billion there. Yeah, I think you see small trims. You rarely see drastic action and what I would refer to as a strategic pivot of any type.
It's very strategic pivots only come in a crisis.
Yeah.
And in that crisis, that's in large measure because the boards are uncertain about direction. They have the belief that continuity is critical and that these companies are like ships and that you sail them carefully through, very, very carefully through these waters of change. However, the really innovative boards will ask a different question. They'll ask the question, if we bring back the scale in a fashion that allows us to invest in other things, then can we see long-term sustainability emerging from it? Those kind of questions are very difficult to answer because it requires a board which is innovative and thoughtful, a CEO and a team that are really see the opportunities that they'd like to invest as opposed to continuity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And many of these companies, you have to ask a slightly different question. It's a little bit like genetics. If I do the delete experiment on this company, what difference will it make?
Right.
So many of the companies exist because they exist, and maybe they shouldn't exist. So I think the board that really challenges itself, what is the raison d'etre for our being here? What is it that we can truly do that's different? Is the board that will triumph. And I think you're seeing that actually right now in Lilly. You're not seeing that in other companies. There are a couple companies that are beginning to think that way, but this putative BMS mega deal, and I really am puzzled, and I think we need to be very clear that the chances of it happening, if it does happen, will be, in my opinion, at least remote, I would hope. And just rumor. I think those kinds of companies really are rare, the ones that can think innovative. And I would hope that there'd be more, but we're not yet seeing that. By the way, the Chinese companies are thinking that way. The
Right.
Chinese companies are saying, innovate, 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 innovate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is their mantra. They're not interested in a lookalike. They're not interested in scale. They're interested in deals to get them into different markets. That's fine. But what they really want to do is drive product, new product, best product.
I want to ask you, I think, about kind of helping handicap the likelihood that this thing's come to fruition, but I promised that I would share a very fun conspiracy theory is the wrong word, is the wrong phrase. But I was talking with someone in Washington last night who said, I wonder if this thing has already been pre-cleared with the Trump administration on an antitrust basis, and AstraZeneca will use its NYSE listing to become an American primary listed company, and it will result in a big win for the administration, and that's how they'll get it through any antitrust hurdles. I don't know if I buy it, but it was a fun idea. I will ask you, however, since you brought this up, how often do do these types of discussions take place? Two CEOs getting together, saying, hey, we should think about something. And we just never see the light of the day on this thing. I know it happens all the time at kind of the smaller company level, but I think there's, a lot of interest in trying to help assess, how far along or how real this might be and how often these type of talks may happen at a hypothetical level or even kind of that kind of semi-advanced level. It's like, hey, let's talk, let's figure this out, but that just never ever make it out into the public eye. You've sat in some of these seats for a while. Is this a does this type of thing happen a couple times a year and we just never see it, or is this a rare incident, do you think?
These types of discussion are extraordinarily structured. They're deeply thought through, and no, it is a theater of the most sophisticated manner that you can imagine. These are not simple, trivial discussions.
Yeah.
People will be highly, highly attuned to even the vaguest hint that it might occur because it has huge ramifications. So, do they occur? Of course, they occur. But is it rare and out of sight? Definitely, and structured in a way that is often through multiple intermediaries so that there can be no clear attribution. And let me go back. I'm not going to let you go with that great conversation that you just. It it is perfectly conceivable that a grand deal could be struck.
Yeah.
I could just imagine what the palace at Westminster would be saying when Sir Pascal Soriot decides to move to America. That's number one.
American flag pin on the lapel and everything. Yeah.
That's correct. Number two, I would imagine that in such a, one could speculate and reasonably speculate that this kind of a gesture would be extraordinarily well received in Washington and all sorts of positive things might come out of it. It doesn't remove the fundamental strategic business fact. These companies are not a fit. The world of finance, of the world of business per se, might give a short-term benefit, but they will not be able to provide a new innovative pipeline. They will be likely removed from the transaction world for some time. And it doesn't take into account what's going on and going to increasingly play into their business, which is the changes that are occurring in China. Now, I think that I love the lovely, almost speculation in Washington. And Washington, I'm sure, is full of all sorts of things.
People, that is what people there love to do. Yes.
That's right. But business is business. And the business facts would have to take enormous changes and stimulus to do this. And I would venture to guess that in the short term, that might be beneficial. In the long term, it doesn't change the broad business dynamic.
Well, I cannot wait to see if or when we get an answer to the questions that you and I are both asking. Certainly hoping that, that at some point we'll gain some clarity on what's going on here. If it is a trial balloon, if they walked it back after it leaked, or if they go ahead with it. We will have you back on when that happens. We'll have to keep talking about this. That is all the time we have for today. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. Pleasure to talk with you, as it is every time. We will be following this story closely, as well as everything else happening in biopharma. And you can keep up with our coverage at endpoints.news or by subscribing to our newsletters. According to this conversation, will live on YouTube. Audio will be up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you've already signed up for our Post Hoc newsletter, you'll get notifications when we have a new broadcast coming up. If you're not signed up, head over to endpoints.news and go to your reader profile to set access to the Post Hoc email. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching for Endpoints News. Huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk. We will see you the next time news breaks. For Endpoints News, I'm Drew Armstrong.